For today, we have a very special guest, and that is the current government CIO and Undersecretary for Digital Development at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communication. In short, Mr. EEST, Luukas Ilves. And before we rightly go into the presentation that Luukas has prepared very carefully, he already shared with us his notes before. So we're already very curious what was actually on those notes, because they were all nicely blurred. Let me just give you a quick background on something which is always good to actually read the formal part next to the one that you know what a person has been doing all the time. So Luukas Ilves is Estonia's Government Chief Information Officer. And most recently, before that, Luukas was the head of strategy at Guardtime, one of the leading blockchain companies here in Estonia and beyond. He previously served in various positions for the Government of Estonia and the European Commission before joining the Lisbon Council, a Brussels-based think tank. Luukas is a graduate of Stanford University. And with that background, I would suggest that, Luukas, without any further ado, you just get right into it. Preparing the stage for the exponential age. Luukas.
Thank you for that nice introduction, Robert. You know, for what Robert was referencing, my notes here are on the whiteboard, so I'll be nicely reading them as we go. The original plan was that I was going to give this talk in May, and then it was going to be sort of me presenting my agenda, having had my first few months in office. But then Robert cruelly moved the date up by a month. So instead of having a static presentation of what will happen and will be done, it's going to be, I hope, more of a workshop in which I can throw some ideas at you that hopefully are in the process of turning into a plan for the next few years, but also get some feedback, some critical questions, as well as raising things I haven't talked about. So what I'm basically going to do is talk for, we'll see, 30-ish minutes, throw out ideas, and then both I'm happy to have you react to what I've talked about, but also throw at me things that are just completely missing. And I'll start sort of with some narrative, right? Anyone who is here in Estonia has, I'm sure, at some point come across the claim that the proverbial Estonian tiger is either sleeping or dead, depending on how brutal imagery you like to have. And of course, what this refers to is, in particular, public sector IT. So we go back to the very fecund and creative period of the 90s and the early 2000s, and both narrowly in how the government did IT and more broadly in digitization of the country. It was a time of just trying out new things. And basically, Estonia was at the time a startup country. There was no legacy, neither in a technological nor in an organizational, legal, et cetera sense. And so things were done sort of shooting from the hip, but that also meant that a lot of things were done well and were done right. And so what we now sort of credit as the sort of foundational components of Estonia, on the level both of sort of technological architecture, you know, infrastructure like the Extra and the EID, as well as applications, things like e-voting, e-prescriptions, and so on, all come from that period where Estonia was not done, as it were. Not complete. And the first thing, of course, just rhetorically to say is when we talk about the tiger having fallen asleep, it's probably not quite right, because if we speak about Estonia more collectively, as you all know, the tiger is just strapped on a unicorn, which is to say that, you know, we can find that same fecundity, creativity, vivacious energy, and also value being created in the broader Estonian IT and sort of tech ecosystem. Is just not focused in government anymore. And it's not, of course, just limited to the tech sector in a narrow sense. There are other elements to that, the fact that we have a lot of domestic capital now, a civil society that's really grown up around that, and so on. Whereas at the same time, government has sort of gone through some of the stages that many new companies go through as they turn into mature corporations in both the good and the bad sense of the word. I don't even think we could really call Estonia a scale up anymore. It's a, you know, 30, you know, if we talk about the Government of Estonia as an organization, it's a 30-year-old enterprise. It's not sort of the biggest corporation, but it's probably sort of on the, actually I checked, sort of basically in the middle of the Fortune 500 in terms of revenue, if you kind of equate tax revenue to operating revenue, and has all of the sort of pains and joys of a 30-year-old company in the IT world and its service delivery. And that kind of, I think, sets the framework for a lot of what we do around digital government. And the first thing I want to sort of throw at you before we get into specific points is this question of whether the startup metaphor that we've just talked about is a constructive one to think about in terms of digital transformation. Because one of the sort of overarching challenges I'm facing, in addition to all the concrete agenda points, is what is the story? What's the narrative, right? What is the journey that we're going through, or what is the sort of the conceptualization of what constitutes good and excellence in public sector IT? And as all of you know, digital transformation isn't just about getting the technology and the infrastructure right. It's about getting that whole vertical from clear business goals down to the tech and technological innovation right. And if we sort of ask ourselves what is it that really stands out about what makes startups work, it's a maniacal focus on product market fit, which expresses itself generally in anything consumer focused on an obsession with user centricity, or customer centricity, or human centricity, use your favorite phrasing there. And that is a mindset that we would do very well to re-import into government. And I think there are also other practices that tech companies have learned and framings that they've learned over the last few decades, not just in Estonia, sort of more globally, that haven't made their way into public sector IT, and probably would help a lot. So for instance, this clear understanding that the business and finding product market fit is not just driven by having a cool product or cool technology, but has to also have a deep understanding of the user, the incentives, the business model. While at the same time, if we actually look at the technology, a very sort of flexible approach to the technology stack, a willingness to not do in-house anything that can potentially be outsourced, that can be done by someone else, and therefore specialization and the returns on specialization. And we could go on that, but I guess one of the things I'm asking is it useful for government not just to talk about sort of entrepreneurship and startups as something to promote and working with startups to be important, but actually to sort of try to think of itself as a startup or perhaps a scale up in terms of how it should function internally, in terms of the roles that we should have in service delivery, in terms of the way we should think about metrics. And obviously there are ways in which the comparison is very imperfect. We talked about product market fit before. And of course, government has generally a static market. We have a near monopoly position when it comes to service delivery. And so there are pressures you don't have as government that you do as a startup. Unlike Bolt, we're not existentially worrying about 2 or 3 competitors coming and doing the same job better. I'll leave aside the existential fear about Russia. That's a slightly different kind of competition. Which is to say that it's not a perfect comparison or a perfect metaphor, but it's something that might work as an overarching story. And it's something, of course, the advantage of which is it anchors into the community we have, the knowledge base we have, and in particular, the fact that the knowledge base we have is no longer one of just a technical expertise, but that we've developed the project management, the marketing, the legal, and so on skills, sort of the full stack of what it takes to be a startup and a scale-up company in Estonia in a way that might be useful to re-import back into the public sector. So that's a kind of background thing to think through, or to bear in mind as we work through some of these thoughts. But what I basically want to do is I have a list of 8 thoughts that sort of cohere in the list, but it's not highly structured, of sort of changes and transformations and goals that I think are worth working on over the next couple of years. And I'm going to run through those 8 thoughts. And then I'm going to stop. And I hope that it's not presented in so chaotic a manner that you're not able to structure your own thoughts and responses. Before I go on, Robert, am I speaking too quickly? Because I usually speak too fast. Am I audible?
A bit too fast, but I think it's still very audible.
Okay. Did anyone not auditorily understand what I was saying about the startup stuff? Okay. So thought number 1, and hopefully, by the way, these are all blindingly obvious, and it's just a question of how we actually execute them in practice. Thought number 1 is that digital does not equal IT. So what we were talking about before in the context of startups, right? The digital transformation is about using technology and technological change to carry out business goals. Or there's a phrasing that was used by a previous government CIO of the UK, which he basically in which he defined what at the time the UK government meant by digital. And the phrasing they had was applying the culture, practices, processes, and technologies of the internet era to respond to people's raised expectations. So that's a nice phrasing, and I think we could talk about others. But the basic sort of mindset here, the mindset that we're challenging is one in which within the Estonian government, digital is seen as its own sort of vertical. The government CIO is responsible for digital. The government CIO's or the budget that he is politically responsible for is the IT budget. And in effect, what we see is that any sort of broader business goal in government, there's a bifurcation between the service itself, the sort of the customer relation, et cetera, and then this sort of digital budget that pays for the registers and the information systems and the actual infrastructure and its operation, which causes all sorts of organizational brokenness, and also means that we don't take advantage of the ways in which mindset and culture have changed in how companies work in the last 15 or 20 years. So some way of sort of articulating the idea that when we speak about digital government, we're talking ultimately about achieving the broader business aims of government, including whatever domain better, and using technology to do so, not just about the actual technology. So e-government is not about talking just about X-Road and EID, although those are very important application layers, but ultimately talking about the business uses to which they're put. And that means that that the value generated should be something that we can express in terms of business KPIs. The Estonian government's been working on having sort of horizontal business KPIs. You've got the Estonia 2035 strategy. I think as a strategy, it's not particularly clear, but it does do one thing well, which is it tries to attribute measurements and numbers to a lot of the sort of policy domains of government. So saying, for instance, in healthcare, we are going to measure the number of healthily lived years and maximize policy around that. In terms of security, we're going to measure something like various indices of the population's sense of security and maximize against that. And so to transfer that back to doing digital, the outcome might look something along the lines of having this sort of clear dashboard and hierarchical structure where we start, for instance, with the business aims of the Ministry of Interior around internal security, or the Ministry of Social Affairs around employment and health, and then ask ourselves, how do both the systems and tools operated directly by government in those domains, as well as the ecosystem that they put together, so how data is shared, how data is used to make decisions, all contribute to actually moving those numbers. And in particular, when we're asking the hard decision in government, which is always resource and funding allocation, that we allocate resources and funding to those things and those measures that actually have at least a strong hypothesis about how they would move the needle in those numbers. There is also, by the way, a managerial challenge here, which is that the tech people, which is to say me, the various e-government agencies, my team, the IT minister, aren't responsible for how well health or internal security run their business. And so if we're trying to sort of evangelize a certain way of thinking and setting business goals and designing products and services, we have to, we have soft tools to use for that. We have skills of civil servants, we've got funding, we've got hegemony of ideas, but we don't necessarily have the ability or the desire to go and tell them how to run their business. If we go, for instance, into the health board and tell them, well, these are the data you should look at, and this is how you should collect your data, and this is how you should sort of do data, driven decision making, they're probably going to, they may even listen to us, but we're not going to be able to tell them what to do because we don't have a granular understanding of the domain. So the policy design challenge here is how can you push that cultural change and the accumulation of capability across government without trying to take everyone over. So that brings me to point number 2, which is a sort of a discrete subset of that, which is funding digital right. And let's start with sort of how digital is funded now. I've alluded to this in a few ways before. The first problem is that we have funding sources that are project driven and that are IT specific. And so for instance, much of the development of IT systems in government, in the Estonian government today, is funded from EU structural and other funds, which basically is able to fund investments, which is to say one-time expenditures, and which generally is used to fund digital sort of technology specific projects, right? So the type of line item that we might have had historically would be updating or refactoring or rebuilding the health register or the prescription system, right? But first of all, if you spend all of, if you've funded your one-time investments, but you haven't thought about the ongoing operational expenditures, you're going to under-index on the operational expenditures, and you're also going to push yourself into doing things in a way that isn't very conducive to using software as a service, to outsourcing. You're going to be focused on big systems integrations, one-time expenditures. And the other problem you're going to have, that you have with the bifurcated money, is that whatever logic and pressure applies to delivering the underlying service well is separated from the IT, right? Or at the end of the day, what we should have prescriptions as a service, which has IT costs, personnel costs, programmatic costs, obviously the material around prescriptions, and those are all within a single collected, container of money, and with trade-offs amongst each other, right? And where we can ask, well, if I automate something, what do I get in terms of labor cost saved, and what's the optimal level of automation? Questions that we effectively don't ask if we have separate IT and everything else pots of funding. And the result of that is, of trying to combine the funding is probably in the short term to create some really unpleasant pressures on government departments, because I think at times the IT money has been more liberal from a budget perspective than some of the funding for other parts of the programmatic expenses. But that's a pressure that needs to be applied if we want to have sustainable funding models. So the second one is funding. The third one, and this is in many ways, I think the toughest, is how we get skills right. And I'm not talking about the broad question of digital skills in society, but the narrower question of the skills of the civil service, in not so much, again, in the narrow sense of using technology, but project management, analytics, product design, user experience design, service design, as well as, say, data analysis, that all sort of at the higher levels of articulating your business goals and how you work with information before you get to the application layer and the infrastructure will determine the nature of your service. Because if we don't have those things right, then we're going to have the wrong applications that have the wrong functionalities and don't deliver value. And the gap there is that most people in government are not used to thinking about the public services they deliver in terms of UX design, product design, metrics around users, A/B testing, and all of these practices that, if we go back to the startup world that we were talking about, are just sort of part of your standard toolbox. So there's a whole toolbox around products and services that any competitive user-focused digital company today has that we don't have in our managerial toolbox. And do we approach that top down? Do we need to worry primarily about the skills, the training, the background of 50 or 100 top managers in government, and leave it there and hope that once they've become enlightened, they'll sort of figure out how to change things themselves? Do we try and reskill 1,000 people across a bunch of agencies that are actually sort of owning services and running them? Do we try and centralize that and have a competence center that sort of works through parts of governments chunk by chunk? What's our strategy around the sort of business skills of digital transformation and service delivery. The fourth point is reconceptualizing a little bit about how we think about digital and cybersecurity. It's basically sort of when we talk about cybersecurity and digital cybersecurity, it is generally in a reactive sense of protecting the infrastructure and the services that we have, preventing them from being compromised in one form or another. But that is sort of an unambitious goal with regards to the infrastructure we've built, in the sense that I would actually hope that our digital infrastructures contribute in a positive, measurable sense to the overall resilience of my governmental and societal systems as a whole. To make that abstract point concrete, I mean, I think this is a line of thought that's already familiar here in Estonia, around a couple of particular applications and instances, right? You've, I'm sure, all heard about the data embassies concept. So again, here the idea is that the fact that we have a single sort of coherent framework for government databases that is slowly moving into cloud means that we actually have a government that is less location dependent and that is able to operate independent of territorial control. An abstract thought when we launched the project almost a decade ago, but one that in the context of what we're seeing in Ukraine right now isn't very abstract, right? The ability to have continuous operation of government independent of what's physically happening in your territory is a valuable contributor to your resistance or your resilience in the face of physical invasion, as well as natural disasters and other sort of black swan long tail events that we nevertheless shouldn't discount completely. So for instance, one of the things we think about is what happens if, say, the Northern Hemisphere or the Eastern Hemisphere or some hemisphere is hit by an electromagnetic pulse that in fact fries basically most of the data we have. Do we have some instance of that available somewhere in the world? You know, or another instance of how infrastructures and services can contribute to broader resilience, we see in the context of digital identity. Ukraine today has, I think, nearly 4 million people who, in addition to the diaspora they already have, are now spread across Europe primarily as refugees. What is the ability of the Ukrainian government to provide them services and support, but also involve them in the democratic decision-making process of the country, whether that is in the shorter term, a referendum about a potential ceasefire, or in the longer term, you know, elections. And here, something that we have already, which is to say digital identity infrastructure, makes it possible, or makes it, you know, reduces significantly the friction of that key sort of service of a democratic society of holding elections. So there's two ways in which infrastructures today contribute to resilience, but I think that's a broader goal we should articulate in the work we do around both cybersecurity and digital government, that the services we have make our government as a whole more resilient, able to react more quickly. You know, if we try and assess the reaction in recent crises, I'd say Estonia gets a mixed grade. In some ways, the existing degree of digitization allowed us to pivot more quickly toward remote work during COVID. Just within government, there was a greater habit of remote working in general, more specifically things that require workflows, signatures, and so on. Of course, we didn't have to come up with alternatives because they're already digital. So we can find plenty of counterexamples of other governments in Europe that really struggled, especially in the first half of 2020, with the absence of physical presence, just problems that we didn't have effectively. But at the same time, we've also seen that building new services is not something we're as fast at or as flexible with as we should be. So in an ideal world, for instance, creating a new public benefit that might require some additional data crunching or a new UI shouldn't require new coding. It should be a question of configuration to existing services. But what we've seen, both for instance in 2020, when the Estonian government had or decided to create a system for reimbursing labor costs for employers, or more recently this year, when the government wanted to reimburse electricity, expenditures in the context of high electricity prices is that the IT solutions required bespoke tailored, or the service required bespoke tailored IT solutions, something which was ultimately done quickly, but nevertheless with the degree of overhead and complexity that isn't necessary. And that brings us to the next point, point 5, which is just doing technology right. 10 years ago, Taavi Kotka, my predecessor, proclaimed the idea of a no legacy policy. And he rightly analyzed or identified at the time, 2012, that e-government services in Estonia, which basically most of the applications were built starting in the early 2000s, were at that point 10 years old and getting older, and that this was creating a legacy problem that Estonia hadn't previously had. Unfortunately, the solutions that he espoused haven't really delivered, insofar as we very much have a legacy problem now of systems that, we don't have that many 20-year-old systems, but a lot of 5 to 10-year-old systems that are architecturally nowhere near where we would expect them to be, which is to say they are not virtualized, they're not cloud native, they are not API based, they are often complex monoliths, which gets in the way of the types of operational flexibility that I was just discussing, which makes it much more difficult to have a whole of government cloud infrastructure, which makes it, for example, much more difficult to move operation, not just sort of databases, but operations of the government outside of Estonia, because again, we have these large monoliths sitting on dedicated infrastructure. So, that's one example. That's on the level of architecture, but we also can talk about sort of other layers of functional specifications where we don't do a fantastic job. Accessibility, so compliance basically with various standards for web accessibility is something where we struggled, where we don't have a very consistent approach. Security, similarly, best practices around both technical and organizational controls. Things are, they're not terrible, but they're not as consistent as they could be. And so we're thinking about how it is that we actually can ensure that the sort of functional, non-functional requirements that a reasonable CTO would articulate for technology done right today in a cloud and API-centric world, that's actually carried out in the IT development we do. So far, previously, our attempts to do so have been tied up in funding. For systems that have been funded in a somewhat central manner, we've also been able to specify cross-functional requirements along those lines, ensure interoperability, things like that, but we haven't had controls of that type for systems that have standalone funding. And so that's meant that we've only applied these sort of requirements in certain circumstances. So one of the things, for instance, again, that some countries have done in digital government is to have horizontal spend controls. Any spend on IT from any funding source in government above a certain amount is subject to a whole host of quality controls. Something like that is probably a measure we need to have to ensure that we really do IT and do tech right. And there, of course, is also the question of consolidation. Estonia sort of talks about its distributed approach to things, and on an organizational level, continuing to have a distributed approach is healthy. But if we talk about infrastructure, applications, technology, there are probably places in which, well, there are places in which we're far too fragmented, and where it's probably healthy to think about the Estonian government as an operational enterprise not being too dissimilar to your average Fortune 500 company, which has a lot of areas where there's a single infrastructure, a single service layer for all different parts of the enterprise. And so I think that's something we've already started with an agency that is providing, or that ultimately will provide consistent workplace services for everyone across government, as well as a single private cloud infrastructure to the extent that private cloud is necessary. The sixth point is how we interact with the private sector. And generally, when Estonians talk about private sector in the context of digital government, they're usually talking about the companies that build services or provide products. So private sector collaboration in the context of procurement relationships. Now, that is not the type of private-public cooperation we had 20 years ago, when a lot of the infrastructures we have now are effectively co-created between the public and the private sector. And it certainly doesn't reflect the wealth of different ways in which government can collaborate with the private sector. And I'll just run through a few now that we do, but that we can do more of. So first of all, there's consuming services instead of products or systems integration hours. That's primarily, software as a service in the cloud context, but there could be other such contexts. Going up the sort of the ladder in terms of value creation, public-private partnerships. Now, there's one very prominent PPP that always gets brought up in the Estonian context, which is the operation of the identity infrastructure, where the CA is a consortium of banks and telcos operating under a public concession. And that worked incredibly well because basically it aligned the business incentives of the CA with generating more users and user uptake, primarily, by the way, from its constituent owners, from the banks and the telcos. And thus we had an adoption curve for our identity that no other countries had. But we actually have very few other examples of PPPs of that kind. And then as we go one step up the value ladder, there's creating markets where government steps back and says that we'll have a competitive market between different private sector service providers, and we'll be in the place of the orchestrator of the market, the regulator, maybe a subsidizer. And I think the general observation I'd make is that new data, new technologies and greater volumes of data give you new opportunities to orchestrate markets like that. And just to give you a couple of examples, one, something that's part of my portfolio is post and parcel delivery, which is kind of funny, but historically telecoms and post have basically been one bundle together. And as post and parcel delivery are regulated today across the world, the delivery of mail remains something for which countries have universal service obligations. So they usually designate one monopoly provider to be responsible for delivering mail across the country. And that made sense historically. Network, it's a network economy service. You might have a natural monopoly. It's no longer necessary today because we have incredible competition when it comes to parcel delivery, a proliferation of ways of delivering mail. And so technologically, there's nothing that prevents government today from setting up a market and saying every delivery of a letter is an event that generates a trace of data that can be tracked. And say in areas of market failure, probably going to look similar to the market failure areas for telecoms, so rural areas, we'll subsidize delivery of mail at whatever the appropriate level is. It could be 30 cents, it could be euro per letter, I don't know. And we'll be completely agnostic on how it's delivered or who it's delivered by. It could be delivered by EEST Post as a courier, it could be delivered by robot, it could be delivered by drone. We don't really care. So that's sort of the type of market you can set up. Another thing that is sort of is being talked about, and there's some experimentation on that I find quite interesting, addresses the fact that government, for all the efforts that we'll be making, is probably always going to be running behind the private sector when it comes to user experience and innovations in user interface. And that is to basically have government APIs below which are services and data, and above which might be private companies operating service interaction, holding a customer relationship. Something that's more common, I think, in other countries than in Estonia. But there are companies sort of piloting some products in those spaces here. There are some sort of challenges there around trust and what role they have in holding the data. But nothing necessarily insurmountable. Last thing I want to raise sort of is a conceptual point around telecommunications, which is that in the way we think about connectivity in Estonia is, I think, still the way the policymakers think about it is very much grounded in the idea of connectivity being the piping. whether that's physical pipes or radio waves, but really the transmission of data. And of course, what we're seeing in the broader world of connectivities is convergence between computing technology and connectivity technologies, both on the technological and on the service layer. So on the service layer first, I mean, today when you stream something, the ability to actually consume that in a convenient way isn't just a function of how broad your broadband connection is, but where the data are located, whether you have an edge blade that's physically located in Estonia serving you your Netflix videos is the case, or whether you have to connect with a server somewhere else in Europe, or God forbid in North America with big latencies. And indeed, the reason that the latencies you experience when you stream something are acceptable are not just because you have a good video connection, but because basically the operators have set up their own infrastructure nearby. And so when we then think about the use cases around 5G, around IoT, AI, augmented reality, that all require significant compute resources away from the device, but still close to the device. And we realize that to achieve what people might think of as a fast connection, we also need to think about the distribution of a lot of computing resources within and around our country. And that, of course, then we get into the next stages of computing, quantum computing and quantum communications, and it will more so be the case. It's hard to distinguish between what's a computational technology and a connectivity technology. And I don't have an answer here other than to say that I don't think we're very mature in how we think about that, conceptualize about that, or how we design those markets to ensure that we also have the computational infrastructure. There's a particular side point here, which is of course, that government on the one hand is thinking about its own computational and connectivity infrastructure, and academia historically and today too sort of usually spends a fair amount of resources and time thinking about their compute and connectivity infrastructure. And while, of course, the various parties here talk, I'm sure we can talk more and collaborate more. And in particular, for the sort of government cloud that we have, one of the things on the to-do list is to figure out how we work with the academic compute resources in Estonia and in the region. So I'm going to try and maybe, I won't say summarize, but pull these ideas together in something somewhat coherent. And basically, I think that, and by the way, the context of all this is we have an e-government and a broader digital society development strategy that was adopted end of last year. So it's a sort of funny situation for me. I come into the job and handed a freshly minted government strategy and said, off you go. Much of what I have talked about on the level of activities is covered in the strategy. So pretty much everything I would want to do on the programmatic level of actually needing to go to someone and say, you go do this and work on this problem, it's sort of in progress and in work. However, the sort of constructive criticism that I have toward all of that is that it's not articulated in a very strategic sense that allows you to make trade-offs between means and ends. It's a collection of activities and a collection of goals without much of a hierarchical relationship between them. And so the cognitive work I've been trying to do, and that is I think hear from my presentation today is still very much a work in progress, is to come up with a way of separating those layers so that we can clearly articulate sort of goals and delivery we have to make, and then look at means that support those ends and have trade-offs between those means, considering taking into account limited resources. So if I had to kind of summarize, I think that the big change we want to make is twofold. One is as a whole to empower across different parts of government the businesses of government to view IT as a means to an end, and help them in doing that. So to do our sort of the parts of the job that we do that are central really well, giving them an application layer that makes it cheaper and easier for them to build new applications, consolidated infrastructure that takes away some of the headache and the pains of how they think about security, how they procure things. And also, point two, allows us to advocate for and to achieve some horizontal values and goals, the biggest of which is users and user experience. hopefully through a much more user-centric culture and approach to design and service delivery, but also other things, security being a very important one. And I think, and hopefully other goals kind of become subordinate to that. So cost and money are very important, but in an ideal world, we think about cost and money not in terms of minimizing cost, but maximizing value. Which is to say, if we can invest another euro in IT and get 3 euros worth of better health outcomes or improved internal security, then that's very much an investment worth making. But not necessarily an easy case to make to a government that's very hawkish on its finances. And not just because a government's hawkish on its finances, but because showing return on investment in IT spend is tough to do in general. And yeah, there we go. So I think that's a good discussion starter, and I already see that there are some questions in the chat. But I don't know, Robert, if you want to start with a kind of structured response to that, please go ahead.
No, I think I leave the floor first to the others, and then we can take off of there. Basically, Ellis, you wanted to quick start this, and you were just getting on when it was about introducing new apps and doing the no legacy strategy, right?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. You definitely got my thoughts going on the topic, and you actually confirmed several of my beliefs as well on that sense. So that was, nice. You talked quite a bit about the resilience and the importance of resilience of the digital systems, both the infrastructure as well as from the service development side. I wanted to ask if you already have thought. I know you're really new in the office, haven't been in that long, but have you already got some ideas as how you could guide the improvement of the infrastructure in the right direction, and how can you actually attract the funding? And like you said several times, money is limited, definitely, but how can we convince our government to allocate enough funding for improving our infrastructure so that we will actually keep being on this highway that we have been going? Because I think right now we're a little bit comfortable in our old, we're the leader position, but we need to actually keep moving to retain this position and actually retain a high quality of our services and infrastructure. So
it's a very good question. Before I give you my thoughts, I actually want to ask you about something in the written form of the question you put in here. You said, how could the government be convinced to invest at the same rate as they did in the 90s and early 2000s? And I kind of want to challenge you on that. I don't think the investment rate was ever particularly high in the 90s and the 2000s. But it's also an open question to you. Maybe I'm wrong. If someone's done the numbers on that and can show that we actually, in a proportional sense, and not in absolute terms, invested more, then that would be fascinating for me to know.
No, that's just a general assumption. I don't have the numbers, luckily or unfortunately. So it's good that you caught me on that, trying to push you in that direction.
Let me throw that as just, and I'll get to your question in a second, but let me articulate that as a question to everyone on the call. One of the challenges is costing things appropriately and identifying hidden costs, right? So this is always, if you're talking about your own infrastructure and legacy versus cloud, and sort of having things provided more as a service, is that the service-oriented approach, its upfront costs look higher. And they look higher for two reasons. One is because, if you have a big investment, you kind of forget about it the next year, and suddenly it seems really cheap as you let stuff amortize, unless your accounting principles count amortization, which they don't generally in government. But also because, if you've got sort of legacy ways of doing things, there are a lot of hidden costs that you basically don't even realize as costs. And so, for instance, right now, we're facing this challenge in just consolidating some of the workplace services, even, where the amount of money that we're saying it costs to provide an employee with a computer and licenses and so on seems to be much higher than the amount that everyone thinks they're currently paying. And some of that may be that, in fact, they haven't been doing as good they've kind of been working below whatever SLA that we're providing, but the other part is probably those costs are hidden there. So I think part of just the challenge on how you invest enough, and we can sort of, there are other parts of this, is how do you properly attribute costs. And that's a kind of standard IT accounting challenge that I think is pretty consistent to any public or private enterprise across the world.
Yeah.
The other bit that's tougher, right, is how you talk about the value of the application. In the sense, in the private sector, that's easier because at the end of the day, any component of the business, you should be asking, how's this contributing to profitability? And of course, in government, we have a whole wide range of KPIs that have nothing to do with profitability. Or, you'd have to come up with some really fancy accounting models to sort of, I don't know, connect, say, people's sense of security to a monetary measure. Yeah. So I think that the shift, to kind of answer you, is for people to think about the IT in terms of how it supports business aims, and then care about the business aims and be disciplined enough about whether the IT is supporting that to make the value proposition. I think the weakness in what I just said is that is really tough to execute, that kind of a shift. And the risk is that basically people kind of default to, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix, and let's let things amortize. I'd say you asked a more specific question about how we can make the infrastructure more resilient. I think a lot of that's already in progress, right? Because a lot of it has to do with whether the architectural principles that we have allow microservices, are modular, allow things to be virtualized. That's all in progress, but I'd say the challenge is it's not happening fast enough and there's not enough pressure to do it. And so in a sense, maybe to flip the logic on its head, one of the things I'm thinking through is, do the resilience concerns that I think now are more so front and presence in mind than they were a few years ago, not just because of Ukraine, but because of the crises we've been for, motivate some of the technological changes. Because the end output really needs to be, when you have a situation where you need to kind of achieve that resilience as a business outcome, which you can define basically in terms of the speed with which you can make a change. Does your technological infrastructure facilitate that, right? Is it, can you go to your tech infrastructure people and say, I want this to be located in a on a server in another country or an AWS, and do they say, sure, that takes me however long the data takes to transfer, a day or whatever?
So we have 10 minutes to go and 5 fascinating questions.
I'm sorry.
So what I would
Robert,
suggest...
you told me we had an hour, we had 30 or 40 minutes to talk, and then we had an hour of questions. So you misindexed on the amount of time we had.
No, exactly.
I think also Ines actually wanted to comment on the resilience part. I saw it on her face because she's researching the agile government and the agile systems in the government. And I saw Ines actually raising her hand on this.
I would suggest maybe we start with Ines and then go with Mikkel and Veronica.
Okay.
Yeah, I just had a few brief comments. Mr. Ilves, I've interviewed 2 of your predecessors, and together with Rainer Kattel, also study politicians and other people responsible also in the IT sector in Estonia. So I have a bit of knowledge, but obviously I'm not Estonian, so I'm not an IT person. But what I find fascinating is to hear across all those interviews that you are carrying over the same legacy and the same problems that Tavi and Sim also had when I heard you talk. And I think your biggest challenge will be to disconnect yourself, or try in a political manner to basically create a more powerful stance for the CIO for the types of things that you want to propose and move forward. And what I love to see, or what I've seen, is that shift from a hugely technologically deterministic point of view. At least that's how that was my impression from your predecessors, and to think more about what is it actually that, and what kind of value are we creating here and for whom. And I think you have that one-time business opportunity with Ukraine, unfortunately, that you can directly tie the KPIs to democracy and trust in government and increased inclusiveness. And we haven't really talked about these. I know these are very, very fluffy goals, and it's very, very difficult to measure, but especially the types of things that you then talked about in terms of what is the public value that we're creating. It's not the individual value or the KPI of a single ministry, but it's what are we doing in general for the citizens so that they want to be part of this country, that they are trusting that the government can still operate even though there are these massive challenges. So I was thinking if that could be refined, and if you could focus more on the types of practices, and also you really talked about mindset, right? So how do we become more user-centric? And agile is not necessarily always the best thing to do, but obviously it's what we do right now, or what most of the digital service teams and also your colleagues in the D11 countries or D9 countries. I lost count for the changes. It's 10. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I think what they have done nicely, also to answer that questions, what are other countries doing in this area, is that they are thinking about the skills and capacity building in new ways. Moving away from that understanding that we as professionals in government have all the knowledge, but that we actually have to now skill up the workforce. And I see lots of digital academies popping up across Europe. Every public administration or the central PA departments are doing that. We haven't really defined what that might look like, but what I see is that most of the leaders don't have those types of skills. And with that, I don't mean the technological skills or understanding your architecture, but understanding what the citizens and your employees need, both as users of the technology.
I think I agree with everything you said, except one point, which is you said something. I think the phrase you used was increasing the power of the CIO position, and I almost think paradoxically that it needs to decrease, in the sense that the responsibility for service delivery, people should not look at me if the IT is not working satisfactorily. Government departments should look at me if they're not getting the components and the services and support for them to run their services well. But if there's a crappy service provided by the health board, they should look at the health board. And it doesn't matter whether the channel is digital or something else. And so I almost want to say I want everyone else to have more power and ownership over their own digital tools and infrastructure than they currently feel. That may mean in practice that in a sort of formal sense, there are some pieces of authority I need to centralize that aren't centralized now, but the outcome isn't a more powerful CIO. There's a discussion 10 years ago, or it pops up from time to time, sort of internationally, on whether the CIO role is going to disappear one day. And I think it's probably, given that it's popped up for the last 15 years and it hasn't happened yet, there's probably something to that cross-functional role. But in asking that question, the underlying idea is that at some point you should have business owners and leaders get this digital thing well enough that they don't need to have some guy waving his hands around talking about it. He just needs to give them some shared services and components. I'm playing with the idea of saying that I should be the last government CIO. Probably not going to happen that way, but it might be an interesting attention-grabbing point.
So what I would suggest now for procedure, I would like to collect the questions very briefly and then let you give the last words then right after. So I would like to call now first Mikkel very briefly, then Veronica, then Stefan, and maybe last words by Thomas.
All right, very briefly. I have gotten the sense that these different Estonian public institutions have a very unequal level of ability to provide tech support, and that's it. As a result, the quality of the service is quite different as well. I mean, what do you see? I mean, do you see it the same way, and what would be the potential solution? Because the centralized IT houses actually tend to produce this idea that IT is something separate, not as a supporter of the business process, or other solutions, or how you see it.
Next, Veronica, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the talk. There was so many aspects of it that I've been thinking about as well that are just, but the main thing I wanted to ask you about is about PPP. Why isn't it working right now in digital space that well? And how can we actually make the cooperation between the public, private, and academia as well to bring that into this cooperative relationship? How can we, make that better?
Yeah. Okay, Stefan and then Thomas.
Thank you, Luca. Again, my point of view is like, as I understood you, the biggest issues as far as categories are the capacity issues and responsibility and skilling issues within the Estonia. But how do you see the lead of the cross-border e-services? Do you find that, as you mentioned, that the power of CIO is pretty strong? Do you find that it should be led by organizational leaders itself, to be organization to organization, or maybe intergovernmental level from the Prime Minister, or even you as someone who is a CIO of the Institution for Cross-Border E-Services itself? Thank you.
Thomas, please, maybe it's last, or you want to go thereafter?
Yeah, I mean, we're focusing on Estonia here, but is anyone else doing anything interesting, anything good, better than Estonia is doing, and what can we learn from that?
Mm-hmm. So let me try and synthesize this into an answer that hits on all the points. The thing that Estonia figured out 20 years ago, and that still is the bread and butter of eEstonia, is this idea that enterprise architecture and to some extent a single application layer, even if the applications are owned by different parties, should be centralized and should be a whole of government thing. Something that's obvious, again, to any Fortune 500 company, but isn't obvious to most governments. And that is X-Road, that is EID, that's a lot of other central components that we have, and also some of the governance around those things. And that the fact that we have acceptance of those principles, that we really do reuse identity, certain data objects, that we do have a certain data exchange layer, more so than even the particular technologies that's used, is an incredible asset for me. The way I think about how this trade-off between the central functions and my office, quote unquote, or what RIA does, for instance, versus the owners of services, applications and products, is that everything we do centrally should make it either cheaper or easier or somehow more effective to provide whatever particular application is you're providing, right? So the existential reason for why you would want to have a central identity component should be so that you don't have to repeat those costs over and over, and you can provide everything in a secure way, in a way that's easy to do, right? So you don't have to sort of have inefficiencies in reinventing the wheel. And so when we think about these sort of, for instance, the differences in capacity and capability between different government agencies, and what centralization can help with is to reduce the amount of effort and expertise that that agency has to have. But there's a limit, right? We can't take over their articulation of the business goals. And we probably can't we can't take over how they think about data and how they think about data objects. And so we have to find that line. And then for everything above that line, it's purely a capacity building question. Unfortunately, the problem is the capacity we're building isn't just a tech capacity. It's a broader administrative capacity. It's a broader public administration capacity. And that is a broader political discourse. That same challenge applies to cross-border services too, right? There are, through single digital gateway and the thing that caused Robert a lot of gray hairs once only, and will cause me some great hairs as we try to implement this. In the European exchange of data, the horizontal digital architecture and infrastructure is the smaller part of the challenge. It's also a cheaper part of the challenge, right? Right now we're building out a bunch of services for this sort of vision of the European once only principle to work. And the smaller part of the money is going to the central infrastructure. The larger part of the money is integrating that with individual agencies, redoing the semantics, thinking through all of that. And that is not something that can inherently be centralized, because we don't know anything about how, what the use cases are for someone moving across border and what they have to prove in Germany and how German law works, and we never will. And so again, there's a limit to how much you can do in a central way, particularly when I can't affect the mindset or the whatever of public administration in other European countries. PPP finally, I don't know. I don't have an easy answer on. I didn't say it's not working well. I think it was more that I don't think we do enough of it. I think there is, for a lot of these sort of innovative ways of the public and the private sector collaborating, part of the challenge is that they require a lot of effort and administrative capacity on the part of the public sector. So there's some of you may be familiar with the Accelerate Estonia program. The idea is precisely to set up markets in the way I was describing. And they basically fund discovery and piloting in that space. And the biggest obstacle they run into is that the civil servants responsible for market regulation who might orchestrate markets don't have the slack time, effort, and energy to actually do that work. And so one of the things to think about is how we build capacity in public sector to be able to do that innovation. Lithuania in this context is a really interesting sort of approach where basically they articulate challenges, not quite missions, smaller challenges, problems that need to be solved. And then they have open tenders for individuals. And basically whoever wins the tender or the competition gets the job and a pot of money, as well as some enablement and empowerment to go change it. So it's sort of, instead of having a position in the public service that sort of is open in a formal sense to this position in this department, you get a mission-driven position and resources to go and change things, and basically additional capacity that's created in that space. And that maybe brings me to Thomas's question about what other countries are doing well in e-governance. It's very hard to give a consistent answer because there are many different layers of doing things well. I'd say areas where others are doing more, all that kind of market design, market-based solutions. I think there are many countries doing much more, particularly those that have sort of a foot in more of an Anglo-American legal and regulatory tradition. And then I think the other thing that a lot of governments do think about more than we do is user interface and user experience. When it comes to core infrastructure, interoperability, all those bread and butter things, I would say it's no longer the case that, or it's not the case that anyone's doing, frankly, much better than us. It's no longer the case that we are head and shoulders above everyone else. So I can give you lots of examples where because someone's renewed some component more recently, it's cooler and better than ours. Identity might be an example. But I wouldn't actually say that anyone's come up with a business model around identity that's better than ours, or has a higher user uptake. And so in a sense, that's a solvable challenge, right? For us to say, well, we need to update the technology, that's something we can do. And then we hopefully are still in a situation where we have the highest user uptake and integration in the world. And that is, again, I think the biggest asset that we have is ultimately it's measurable in users, it's measurable in collaboration and data flows, not necessarily in particular technologies or applications.
Thank you, Luukas, for that roundabout on everything, both with your plans. On the other hand side, actually still seeing that the wheel cannot be reinvented overnight. And so in the end, it's still similar challenges, but obviously making yourself obsolete is always of a good aim. But sometimes you also need to think about yourself. So that's the only thing I might want to pass on a personal level. With that, I thank everyone for the great contributions and invite those that can still stay on to maybe also some last words from you, Luukas. Please.
So first of all, just because Robert told me we'd be going till 3:15 or 3:30, I moved some other meetings. So if anyone wants to hang around till 3:30 and chat,
that's what I just wanted to say.
Free. But the other thing before then is just to say that for anyone that does need to go, if you have any thoughts that were triggered by this conversation, any papers of yours or others you'd like to share that touch on all of this, please do write me. I'm going to throw my email address into the chat, although it's pretty self-explanatory, lukas.ilves@mkm.ee. So all of the questions and the topics I raised, I'm actively working on, and I don't have simple answers. In particular, I think, though, this is sort of nerdy, but costing models, cost attribution models, methodologies of any kind, really valuable, because it's one thing to have the ideas, it's another to be able to put them into a bureaucratic process that will consistently produce results.
just going to give you one answer to that time. It actually helps to produce costs. But with that, I would like to close now the official recording